Welcome back, everyone. Ready for another deep dive?
Always.
Awesome. Today we're looking at one of the most fascinating parts of Frankenstein.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Chapter 6, to be exact. The one where Elizabeth Lavenza writes a letter to Victor. It's on the surface, it's a simple letter, like a get well message.
Right.
But trust me, there's a lot more going on. Way more than meets the eye.
Oh, absolutely. It's incredible how Shelley uses this seemingly ordinary letter to reveal so much about the characters and their world, you
It's like
know?
we're getting a glimpse into Victor's life that even he might be missing.
Exactly. And we see it all through Elizabeth's eyes. She's obviously super worried about him, about Victor. But there's this warmth and optimism in her words.
Right. You can't miss it. It just shines through. She comes across as so kind and caring.
It's more than just kindness, though. There are certain phrases, like when she talks about feeling his illness as keenly as her own, or when she describes everything going on at home in such detail, it reveals a profound empathy. And you get this sense of her really longing for that connection with him.
And that makes the contrast with Victor's world even more striking.
Yeah.
I mean, he's totally consumed by his scientific pursuits,
Right.
pushing himself to the limit, isolating himself from everyone.
Mm-hmm. It's almost like he's rejecting everything that Elizabeth holds dear. Like they're on completely different wavelengths.
Absolutely. It makes you think, right? Like, is Elizabeth's more traditional world, her domesticity,
Mm-hmm.
is that a strength?
Mm,
Is it like a moral compass that Victor's lost sight of?
right. Or is it a weakness, maybe? Does it leave her unprepared for the dark stuff Victor is dealing with?
Ooh. That's a good point. It's like Shelley's setting up this clash between two very different ways of seeing the world.
Yeah.
Okay, so beyond Elizabeth, her letter also gives us this fascinating peek into life in Geneva.
Yes.
The importance of family is so clear, and we get these hints about social customs and even economic differences.
Like when she mentions those visits they get for upcoming marriages. That shows how important community and tradition were in 18th century Geneva. It was considered a pretty egalitarian society back then.
And she talks about the servants, but not in the way you might expect.
Hmm.
It's not that typical rigid class system. She emphasizes their education and dignity.
Hmm.
It feels different from how servants were often portrayed, say, in English literature.
You're right. That little detail is so revealing about Elizabeth's perspective, and maybe even Shelley's own commentary on social structures. Makes you wonder if Victor, with his fancy background, already feels like an outsider, even before the monster comes into the picture.
Speaking of outsiders, Elizabeth's letter introduces us to Justine Moritz, that young woman taken in by the Frankensteins.
Right.
Seems like a minor detail, but her backstory, man, it's rough.
It really is. Her mother couldn't love her, blamed her for the deaths of her siblings, attributed it all to God's judgment.
It's more than just a sad story, though, isn't it?
It speaks volumes about the religious beliefs and anxieties of the time.
It's a chilling reminder of how women were blamed for things beyond their control, especially when those things challenge religious norms.
Oh, exactly. And that fear of female agency, of women defying expectations, it's a theme that echoes throughout the novel.
Wow. Yeah.
You could even argue that Justine's story foreshadows the creature's own experience,
Huh.
the rejection and the novel's critique of social prejudice.
I never thought of it that way. Wow. That's amazing. Now we can't forget all those little hints of foreshadowing in Elizabeth's letter.
Right.
From Ernest wanting to be in the military to the very specific mention of Justine's beauty. It's like Shelley is carefully planting the seeds of tragedy.
And these details aren't just for suspense, they're symbolic, you know? Think about how Elizabeth describes spring, all vibrant, full of life. While Victor is recovering from this dark, isolating winter, it's like a visual representation of their totally different worlds.
It's almost like the calm before the storm, right? Knowing what these characters are headed for.
Yes.
It's almost unbearable. While Elizabeth's letter paints this hopeful, normal picture, Victor's reaction shows the turmoil inside him. We see him writing back, wanting to comfort his family, but then later he pulls away from his scientific work, horrified by what he's done.
Yeah. That change is so important. It's the start of Victor's breakdown. The weight of his creation, the burden of his ambition, it's all crashing down on him. Interestingly, this struggle is mirrored in the introduction of two very different professors, M. Crimp and M. Waldman.
Oh, right. Crimp is so harsh, dismissive of Victor's past studies. He almost embodies the scientific rigidity that Victor's beginning to reject.
And then there's Waldman, encouraging and supportive, showing a more humane side to science. It's like they represent the angel and devil on Victor's shoulders.
It's like Victor's stuck between two worlds, two opposing forces, and he doesn't know which way to go.
Absolutely. And don't forget Henry Clerval, Victor's loyal friend.
Yeah.
Arriving just as Victor's grappling with these demons.
Right. Clerval, with his fascination with literature and the humanities, such a contrast to Victor's obsession with science.
He's like a breath of fresh air.
Clerval seems like the friend who'd take you to a poetry slam when you're feeling down. Not a bad distraction from creating a monster.
I love that. But seriously, Clerval represents a more balanced life, one that values creativity and connection. The question is, can that be enough to save Victor?
I guess we'll have to see. Things are getting pretty intense. But before we get totally swept away, I want to take a closer look at Elizabeth's letter itself.
Okay.
Her writing style is so vivid, so engaging. What stood out to you?
Well, the contrast between her voice and Victor's is striking.
Right.
Hers is full of warmth, compassion, genuine concern for others. It's such a difference from Victor's, brooding and introspective narration.
Yeah, I noticed that too. Her descriptions are so detailed. It's like you can picture everything. The streets of Geneva, the Swiss landscape, even little William's dimples when he smiles.
Exactly. And these details aren't just there for decoration. They're creating this sense of normalcy, of a world that exists outside of Victor's scientific bubble, a world that, in many ways, he's losing touch with.
It's like she's grounding us, reminding us that there's still beauty and joy to be found, even as things get darker.
It's making me think about how we often miss those little signs in our own lives, right?
Right.
Those tiny details that seem small but could be pointing to something bigger.
That's a really profound thought. It's like Shelley is telling us to pay attention. Not just to the big stuff, but to those everyday moments that make up our lives.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've talked about Elizabeth Justine, touched on Victor's inner struggles. But before we go further, I have this one question that keeps bugging me.
Oh, what is it? I'm curious to hear it. What's on your mind?
Well, I keep thinking about Victor getting Elizabeth's letter at this exact moment. Like, what if he hadn't gotten this reminder of home and the people who love him? Would he have continued down this dark path with the same intensity?
Ooh, that's a really interesting question. It's impossible to say for sure, but it definitely highlights how important those connections are, right? Those anchors to our humanity, especially when we're heading into dangerous territory, like Victor.
It's like Elizabeth's letter is a lifeline, a beacon of hope, shining through all the darkness that's closing in around him.
And yet, we know that even that lifeline might not be enough. Shelley is brilliant at creating this tension between hope and despair. It makes you wonder if tragedy is unavoidable.
Which brings me to another question. What role will Elizabeth play in all of this? Victim, savior, something else entirely?
That's the big question, isn't it? It's what keeps us glued to the story. We care about these characters. We want to know what happens to them.
I know. It's like watching a train heading straight for a broken bridge. You know it's going to be a disaster, but you can't look away.
That's a perfect analogy. There's this feeling of inevitability, like a storm you can't outrun.
Before we get too lost in the doom and gloom, I want to shift gears for a second and talk about the letter itself.
Okay.
I'm struck by how Elizabeth weaves in these little glimpses of other characters' lives.
Yeah.
It's like a mini portrait of their whole society, wouldn't you say?
Totally. Shelley uses these small details to create this rich, textured world. We see engagements, marriages, even little misfortunes. It reminds us that even in a story focused on Victor and his creation, there's this whole tapestry of lives going on around them.
And those details tell us so much about the social norms of the time. Remember when Elizabeth mentions the guy who lost his fortune?
Yeah.
She says he's bouncing back and about to marry a rich widow.
Right. It shows how much they valued social mobility and resilience, like even setbacks could be overcome with the right connections and a bit of luck, which is a huge contrast to Victor's isolation and despair after he creates the monster.
It makes you wonder if Victor, with his pursuit of knowledge, has lost sight of the simple joys and connections that make life meaningful. He's traded the warmth of human interaction for that cold, sterile lab.
That's a sharp observation. It really points to this central theme in the novel, this tension between ambition and connection, between chasing knowledge and needing human contact. Still relevant today, isn't it?
Totally. Okay, before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I want to go back to something we mentioned before the foreshadowing.
Yeah.
Elizabeth's letter is full of these little hints, these seemingly innocent details that point to the darkness coming. It's masterful.
It really is. And she does it so subtly, like a whisper in the back of your mind. Remember when she mentions Justine's beauty?
Yes.
It's almost like she's unintentionally marking her for tragedy.
And then there's Ernest wanting to join the military, which feels like a guarantee of a bad ending, given the novel's themes of violence and destruction. Just thinking about it makes me nervous.
It's unsettling, right? And it shows how Shelley can create this sense of dread, even in peaceful moments. Even Elizabeth's own anxieties, even though she sounds cheerful, suggest that she's not immune to the darkness surrounding them.
It's like she can sense that something's wrong, but she can't quite figure out what it is. That feeling is all over the novel.
Yeah.
Keeps you on the edge of your seat.
Definitely. That's part of what makes Frankenstein so captivating. Shelley blends the ordinary and the extraordinary, the beautiful and the grotesque, the hopeful and the tragic. This constant interplay is what keeps us hooked.
It's amazing how much we can discover from just one letter. It's like peeling back the layers of an onion, finding a whole new world underneath.
It's the power of great literature. These books aren't just stories to be read and forgotten. They're invitations to explore human experience, to wrestle with big questions, and hopefully come away with new insights.
I feel like a literary detective, piecing together clues, uncovering hidden meanings.
And that's exactly what Shelley wanted, I think, to make her readers think critically and to leave them with more questions than answers.
Speaking of questions, I have one more that's been on my mind. I've been thinking about the letter as like a bridge between Victor's world and the world he's leaving behind. Elizabeth describes these everyday things: births, deaths, marriages, money problems, the stuff that makes up a life, a community. But Victor, with his big ambitions, he seems so disconnected from all of it.
Yeah, that's a great point. It's like he's stepping outside of the natural order, that whole cycle of life and death, into this realm of creation and destruction that he doesn't really get. And the consequences are, well, we know how it ends.
Right. He's so focused on his goals that he can't see how his actions might affect other people. Like, is his blindness a kind of arrogance, thinking he's above the rules?
That's an interesting thought. There's definitely some hubris there, this belief that he can control nature, unlock the secrets of life and death without any consequences. And Elizabeth, with her innocence and love, she almost represents that humanity that he's turning away from.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what do you think is the big message Shelley's trying to get across in this letter? What should our listeners take away from all this?
Well, I think the biggest thing is the importance of paying attention, not just to the big dramatic stuff, but to those little details, the subtle things that can tell us so much about ourselves and the world.
Like she's saying that nothing is really insignificant. Every word, every action, it all has consequences.
Exactly. And I think she's also saying to value those connections, the people who keep us grounded, especially when we're tempted by ambition or driven by things we don't understand.
Because as we see with Victor, those connections can be our lifeline, what keeps us from losing ourselves.
And sometimes even a lifeline isn't enough, but we should still fight for those connections. Try to be present and aware of how our choices affect others.
Well said. So as we move on from Elizabeth's world, I hope everyone listening remembers her words. Pay attention to the small things, cherish the people you love, and remember that even in the dark times, there's always hope.
And by really diving into great books like Frankenstein, maybe we can find the strength and wisdom to handle our own complicated world.
And that's a wrap on our deep dive into Elizabeth Lavenza's letter. We hope this got you thinking in new ways and that you'll revisit this classic story with fresh eyes. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep reading.